Hello, it's Friday the 10th of December. You're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart, and joining me in the studio tonight is Linda Fabiani. Hello, Linda. Glad you could be with us. So the two of us will be looking back at some of the main stories in the news for this week. But first of all, I'm going to begin with today's coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,753,527 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,995,714 have been confirmed negative and 757,813 have tested positive. There are 5,018 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test today. Although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. 19 new deaths have been reported today from people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,707. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 573 were in hospital last night, 40 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,359,959 people had received their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,969,494 had received their second dose, while 2,040,070 people have received their third or booster dose. The latest UK daily figures show 146,255 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 120 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. And now on that topic, Linda, we're going to look at the announcement today from the First Minister on the Omicron variant.
Yeah.
Have you been able to get a handle on that?
I did. I listened to it today because I just knew it was going to be a really important announcement. And I didn't hear the questions afterwards because I was listening on the radio and got cut off fairly quickly. But what really struck me today was how sombre the First Minister was. And how it just came across so strongly to me how worried she is. I could feel it coming from her. She is seriously worried about this. I don't think that we can overemphasise the seriousness of this situation. She's obviously had briefings which have given her great concern, and she's doing her best to try and keep people as safe as possible. I heard Jason Leach tonight as I was driving in here on a news programme, and again he was being very sombre, very serious. There's obviously a huge concern about Omicron, and it's about the rate at which it transmits. You know, it's almost like doubling every day, and it can spread round a close crowd like wildfire. So it's extremely worrying. The good news is that although there's been talk about, the fact that people who've been double vaccinated can still get it, and they're still doing research into the effects of it and how seriously you can get it, what Jason Leach was saying tonight was that the booster is proving fairly effective in cutting down transmissions. So, yeah.
Yes, I did.
A way to go.
I also heard Jason Leach saying on the radio this morning that the best defence is to go for the third booster. Mm-hmm. Now, on the detail of what the First Minister told us today, first of all, you referred to how quickly the new variant is growing. I don't know if this is any use, but we have a graph from the Scottish Government here. You can look at the website, but what this shows you here is what's known as exponential growth. And we're talking there about, I think about the famous parable of the grains of rice on the chessboard. If you put one on one grain, and then you double it, 2, 4, then very soon you're in thousands. And that's what we've got here. It is doubling. I think the First Minister said something like just over every 2 days. Fortunately, not every day, but just over 2 days. But that still means if you've got 1,000 cases today, you'll have 2,000 on by the end of Sunday, and then 4,000 Tuesday, and then 8,000, etc. So if we don't stop it, it will in fact increase like those grains of rice on the chessboard, and that's maybe why the First Minister was so worried today.
Well, and she's worried about people's health. Of course she is, because there are vulnerable people for all sorts of reasons. She's worried about the effect on the economy as well. People's well-being. It's not just physical health, it's mental well-being too. So she's obviously very, very worried, but her first priority has got to be public health. So everything she does is informed by keeping as many people safe as possible. And also, and what a job to have, her and all the others that are involved, trying to make sure that our hospitals continue to operate and that people can get medical attention. And with all the attendant problems that this causes for other conditions that people need treated, it's a heck of a bind to be in, but public health has got to be the first priority.
And that's definitely the point the First Minister was making. As you say, she had a very serious attitude to the announcement today. You've reminded me of the point, what you might say is a debate. Do we go for opening up the economy to bring back jobs, to go for economic growth, or do we concentrate on hitting the virus? Now, I'm reminded of the words of Professor Dr. Devi Schroeder, who several times she said we shouldn't see it as an either or. We should say, let's get rid of the virus and then we can open up the economy. Now, just to give an example of that, the First Minister said today that already, because of people reporting COVID or people reporting being close to positive test results, that means already something like 60 trains have had to be cancelled today. So what the First Minister is reminding us is it's not really either or. If we don't get on top of this new variant, the economy will suffer anyway.
Well,
so we have to deal with them both.
It might just take a little bit longer, if we say, all right, just carry on, let it go like wildfire, there will come a point where it does affect the economy because people will be ill. And I thought another serious point she made today was about the A&E department, which is already losing staff who are self-isolating because of a perfectly innocent gathering. And she was at pains to point out that it wasn't the fault of anyone in particular that this happened, but it's a mark of how easy it is if we don't take great care to pick up this Omicron variant.
And it is it's about not overburdening the health service. That's another point that the First Minister stressed today, that if we want to make sure that the usual winter strains on the health service aren't even worse, perhaps getting to the point of being unmanageable, then we all have to do our best to not spread the virus. And again, she reminded us this virus wants to spread from one person to another. So it's up to us to take measures to not let that happen. So let's just look at the question of measures. The First Minister didn't announce any changes today, although if it continues to grow as we have seen, who knows? I think that's something we can't rule out. Do you think the measures are sufficient? We were reminded today to work at home if possible, obviously wear a face mask in public places and on transport. Do you think the measures are sufficient?
Well, the advice from the Scottish Government, the First Minister, hasn't changed hugely in terms of maintaining social distance, in terms of wearing face masks on public transport and in certain locations. And this has been the case in Scotland for a long time. It's only just been reintroduced south of the border, where they're now saying, oh yes, we have to do this because of Omicron. We've had that in place a long time. The changes she talked about today as well were about if you have someone in the household who tests positive, you should self-isolate for 10 days. I think that's a bit of a change, and that will affect people. But people should be working from home where possible. Sadly, it's more difficult for some than for others. There's people who can't work from home. Their jobs just don't allow working from home. And that's those who are giving service to the rest of them, bless them, the rest of us. And I've got such respect for all these folk. But I think people in Scotland generally are taking this seriously. Folk I've spoken to from all walks of life recognise that it's up to all of us to play our part. Sadly, you get the detractors, the naysayers, who just don't seem to believe that we have a problem. But They are fewer in Scotland than perhaps there are elsewhere.
I think so. I did hear Dr. Steve Reicher from St Andrews, I think, last week talking about trust in the government. If people believe the government is first of all talking the truth, and also that the government is taking it seriously, then people are more inclined to take it seriously. So again, I think the First Minister is saying she doesn't want to have to do any more of these COVID briefings, but it's a responsibility that she'll have to take. Another point the First Minister made, I read out numbers today which didn't seem too bad, but the First Minister pointed out that the number of infections has actually increased quite a lot. In fact, it's almost doubled since last week. Now, although the numbers in hospital are not very high at the moment, the First Minister suspects that this is an underestimate. And that's because the testing basically doesn't pick up if you've got Omicron or anything else. But what does pick it up is the genome sequencing. And in particular, there's something called the S dropout, but that has to go to labs and it has to be tested in a way that takes much longer. So although there's maybe only about 100 cases identified, it's quite likely that there's 1,000. And so that's why I said earlier on, if it's doubling every 2 days, then pretty soon we're going to be in tens of thousands. So that's why it's important to act on it now.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is that folk like me, folk like you, Hugh, we're not experts. We can't begin to be experts. Shouldn't pretend to be experts. I'm amazed actually how many people think they are experts because they've just read a few Twitter feeds. However, I feel very seriously that we're not. And I do have trust in those that are heading up the fight against this. I do have trust in Nicola Sturgeon and her government to be telling us the truth. I have great trust in people like Devi Serdar and people like Jason Leach and all those other people who are coming on very seriously and from the professionalism and their base of knowledge saying, please, everyone take this seriously. This is such a very important thing. And what we're trying to do is cause as least disruption as possible. And the bottom line is stop as many deaths and serious illnesses as possible. So I feel that I have to trust those who are more in the know than me. And thankfully, I feel that I do trust them.
And so the message finally, before we move on to the next story, I'm sure we will come back to Omicron next week, Linda. But the message is, let's get on top of this. Let's do what we can. And I should underline, I've not been very good myself at taking tests up to now, but in the studio here, our team have all decided that we are all going to take tests.
Yeah.
I did today, in fact, and so did you, Linda. So we are negative, that's why we're here. And before I come into the studio in future, I'm going to have a negative test, or I won't be here. Maybe I'll be working at home as well. Just finally, another point that Jason Leach underlined today on the radio is he said that the measures that we've taken already have probably saved 27,000 lives in Scotland.
Oh.
If we hadn't been doing the mitigation we have been doing for the last couple of years, then the death rate certainly would be higher than it is now. So it is working. The mitigation measures are working. So we can all stick to it and we can do our best to keep on top of it. So we no doubt will be talking about Omicron again as it becomes a dominant strain. So now I'm going to move on to our next story for tonight. It's my party and you'll die if I say so. There's been a lot of very rueful comments on social media about parties and Number 10 and the Prime Minister. So the story we had so far, let's see if I'm up to date with this. So last week, there wasn't a party, or there probably wasn't a party, or if there was a party, the rules were followed, but there wasn't a party anyway. So the story has changed this week. So we're referring, of course, to the party which took place about a year ago at Downing Street when we were all in lockdown and when the Prime Minister Johnson said that all Christmas parties have to stop, really. And by the way, the First Minister has also said it's a good idea if you don't have office Christmas parties this year, particularly because we want people to still be able to go to work. I forgot about that one. However, the government, apparently, the UK government was partying in Number 10 last year. And so everyone will probably have seen or heard about the video where the Prime Minister's press team were discussing the party that never happened. So that was all last week. The news we have this week is that the Prime Minister has actually been in the House of Commons and has said Well, I'm shocked to discover that there actually was a party at number 10. And he's going to take the usual action which we take in severe cases like this, which is to announce an inquiry. So is that the end of that, Linda?
Oh man, I talked earlier about having a lot of trust in the Scottish Government. I have absolutely no trust at all in Boris Johnson and his government. I listened to him saying in the Westminster House of Commons that he didn't know about the party and how shocked he was. I don't know whether to believe him or not. I have no idea. I don't necessarily believe anything that comes out of the man's mouth. However, see, even if he didn't know about this party, and if he doesn't know about all these other things that have been going on, those that he has appointed in very senior positions in his team, I can't remember the name of that woman that was greeting outside her house because she'd lost her job, which also annoyed me because it's not as if she's going to have to turn up at the food bank, Anyway, she's got some name that I can't remember. But he put these people in place. His judgment is very, very flawed. If he's putting people in place who have such a lack of respect for those of us that they're supposed to serve, then his judgment is flawed. He's not in control. That's a problem in itself. So there's a lot of issues about this that I find really, really difficult. Announcing the inquiry, I'd have thought the Cabinet Secretary's got enough to be doing just now. We're in the middle of a pandemic, there's lots of stuff happening, and he's got to run around finding out whether these numpties that are at the top of government were being so arrogant as to ignore rules and guidance that everyone else has to follow. So I think it's an attempt to kick it into the long grass for a start. I don't believe anything Mr. Johnson says. And do you know the other thing that I keep thinking about? Unless I've missed it, I've not seen anything anywhere that tells me where Boris Johnson was that evening. Was he up the stairs? They got wonderful soundproofing. Where was he? If he wasn't at the party, where was he? I've not seen anything that has noted that. And what struck me was, see if he was definitely not there for a few days or whatever, I thought he would have been at pains to point that out very quickly. So, was he around?
Well, the Prime Minister's very fond of taking a holiday, so when I first heard about this, I thought, well, maybe he was at Chequers or maybe he was in a nice island somewhere. I think the technical point is that the family doesn't actually live in number 10. I think they live in number 11, but obviously if there's a party at the neighbours going on till midnight with young children, you might knock on the wall.
But see if he does his MP's job properly and representing people that he's supposed to represent. He will have had constituency complaints in their hundreds, if not thousands, about antisocial neighbours and everything else. You hear things. You know things are going on round about you. So even if he's next door and up the stairs, it's not a multi-storey where they're in the ground and he's on the 20th floor. There's just something about, I feel quite suspicious about the fact he's never said where he was.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues about this. There's a lot of unknowns. Well, I'm sure in 2 years' time we'll hear when they inquiry reports. But one of the issues that's been raised is about the role of the Metropolitan Police. Because, of course, people last year were fined. There are loads of cases that have been in the news this week of student parties, for example, broken up by the police and people receiving a fine for having a party for doing exactly what is alleged to have happened in number 10. So what do you think of the idea that the Met Police don't think there's anything to investigate because they haven't got any evidence?
I think it's a pile of nonsense. Now, I can understand that if I was to phone up the police and say, do you know what, see, a year ago, the people in the next cul-de-sac to me had a party and I want you to investigate it. I could understand them saying, look, we'll never find out what happened there, don't be silly. Do you have any evidence? Whatever. But we're talking about the most public figure in the 4 nations of the UK who is in charge of those who allegedly had this party that we've all heard about. We have seen Allegra Stratton, that's that wifey's name. We have seen her making a complete idiot of herself at a dummy run press conference and somebody's leaked that. Therefore, we have seen that something did go on. Now, I know that Boris Johnson lies. I know that others in his administration do as well. However, if the police were to interview those that are on the guest list, because when it takes place in that location, there must be a guest list, if they were to interview them, they could come up with evidence. I have no idea why they're not. And I have to say, the more I hear about the Met these days, it's just like every other day, there's another terrible indictment of the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, there must be a book. There must surely be a logbook of who's in and who's out. And anyway, if there's not, people have pointed out that it's a secure location. There must be cameras. There must be people
Absolutely.
looking at it all. How could 50 people sneak in to have a party and nobody noticed? So, again, that's one of the things that's going to be covered. Just before we move on, and the interesting point to me about this is about what's been happening in the House of Commons about the conduct of the Prime Minister for a couple of weeks now. In fact, Ian Blackford actually said in the House of Commons that the Prime Minister is a liar, and that was he was allowed to say that because usually you can't, of course, accuse an honourable member of lying. But the whole debate that the SNP had a couple of weeks ago was about the Prime Minister's lack of candour, shall we say. So there's a whole list of statements that Ian Blackford read out where the Prime Minister has clearly misled the House. And that's supposed to be a resigning issue. So what I'm going to ask you about this is the question of, is there any point in trying to force a no-confidence motion in the House of Commons? Because that really depends on the Tory backbenchers moving over to the opposition side. They're not going to do that, are they?
Well, first of all, can I point out a wee error you made, Hugh? He called a dishonourable gentleman a liar, not an honourable gentleman. Is there any point? I mean, I know that some of the backbench Tories are really, really angry about this, they have said. I can see that. They must be discontent, but at the end of the day, they want to hang on to government. So if they see Boris Johnson as the best option for hanging on to government, I mean, I fail to see how he could possibly be, but then I fail to see how he was ever elected to be Prime Minister in the first place. That's a judgment call they will make. They can be as angry as they like, can be screaming and shouting about all these things, because it's not just this. This is just another thing in a long list. But if it comes to them thinking that they will lose government in any way, they'll close ranks and keep him there. And perhaps their internal machinations will ensure a leadership contest further down the line. But they're very, very good at sticking together when push comes to shove.
And finally, yes, I think you're right to say that eventually, in terms of electoral success, if the Conservatives think that their leader is now a loser, then they'll ditch them pretty soon. So we might get some indication on that next week, because I think it's next Thursday the Shropshire North by-election takes place, occasioned by the departure of Owen Patterson.
Oh gosh,
so
I've forgotten all about it. Well, there's another thing. I mean, when that stuff started, I thought that might be, towards a final straw. We've forgotten about that because he's come up with something else. And it's like every other day there's something else. Even after the party in Downing Street, we're hearing, the report about the fact that the donations that went to do up his flat, that he was less than truthful about some of that. So it's just one thing after another. Do you know, I'd completely forgotten about that by-election.
Well, the reason I mention that is because that might be a bellwether, because in a way it's got nothing to do with you and me as voters in Scotland, because this is the Conservative Party which was put in power basically by English voters, and a Prime Minister who was put into office basically by English members of the Conservative Party, and next week some English voters in North Shropshire are going to maybe decide the fate of the Prime Minister. So in all this, we in Scotland are really just spectators. We can't do anything about it.
When will they waken up? Though, I have to say, when will everyone in Scotland waken up and realise we're better off without these chancers and we should be making our own decisions?
Well, I think on that point, Linda, we'll move on to our next topic. We're going to look again now, briefly, at the Scottish budget, which was announced yesterday by the Cabinet Secretary, Kate Forbes. I know that Andrew discussed this last night. Some more comment today on the budget. Various organisations, various campaigning organisations today have welcomed some of the measures taken, and I think the most eye-catching was the £20, the total £20 child payment. It will go up to £20 from April. This new budget announced yesterday comes into force, of course, in the financial year beginning April. So Scotland already has a £10 child payment, and that's going to be doubled. The figures suggest that up to 40,000 children will be taken out of poverty by that measure. So I think that's clearly a major one that's caught the news. Anything else eye-catching for you in yesterday's budget?
Well, I looked at it, and I looked at the comments round about it as well. It seemed very clear to me that what this budget is, it's as far as possible a recovery budget. But there are big issues that still need addressed. But I think what Kate Forbes and the Cabinet have produced is the best possible options to take us forward. Now, I hear the opposition and others saying things like, oh, this they've got more money now than they ever had. Really? We're dealing with a pandemic and everything that happens with that, So let's not pretend that the Scottish Government has all this money to spend on the wish list of every MSP sitting in Holyrood. It's a tough gig. And I think what Kate Forbes has done is look at it and say, how can we best help people? The child payment, it's a great thing. And we should never forget that Scotland's unique in this. We've got a Westminster government that's taken 20 quid off people's universal credit. We have a Scottish government that had already introduced a £10 child payment and is doubling it in April. I'm pleased at some of the stuff about social housing and other things too. All very important. But we're living in a situation just now where things change. And, yesterday we had a budget. Today we've got a very, very serious announcement by the First Minister and a recognition that actually we don't know what things are going to be like next week, never mind 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. So I think there also has to be a recognition that we should be constantly looking at what's been budgeted. And I know there are commitments made that the opposition will keep screaming about if they're not met, but let's have some realism about this. We're in a changing situation, and it may well be there have to be budgetary changes as well as we go through the next year.
Yes, Kate Forbes has stressed that we're not really getting enough of a payment, enough of a recognition of the continuing COVID costs. It's almost as if the UK government has decided, well, that's COVID finished, let's move on. Of course, Chancellor Sunak's budget was several weeks ago. But even when Kate Forbes announced it, we didn't really know that the Omicron was going to be as serious as it is. Exactly. So perhaps we've all been taken unawares. And it really is too early to start talking about post-COVID, although Kate Forbes did say this is a budget for recovery. But
recovery might be further in the future than any of us thought. Certainly, Kate and those who assist her with it thought when they were putting things together, because you don't do these things the night before. It's months of preparation and some very fine minds who are looking at this stuff.
And another aspect that people may have been talking about is that the budget announced funds for Scotland's National Care Service. Now, this is a proposed service, really the equivalent of the NHS. So it has the same kind of economics, if you like it. If we didn't have an NHS, then you get the health you can afford. And to some extent, that's what we have under care, of course. We've discussed this previously. Yeah. The care regime does mean that, you have to pay a huge amount, particularly if you have to go into residential care. And so really the only way of dealing with it is to have care provided according to need and not according to your bank balance. But we're just starting there, aren't we? So this is the beginning of the foundations of a care service.
It is the beginning of it. Well, there's been care services there through local authorities and others. It's the beginning of a national care service, which brings in human rights as well, a big issue today. And it's the right of everyone to expect a decent care service and that they will be looked after. So yes, it's the beginnings. I noticed there was an increase in the minimum pay rates for care staff. I'm pleased about that. I would like it to be more, but I think, as we talked about, we've got to be realistic about budgets and everything else. And so much is relying on the UK government as well when it comes down to it. We should never forget that. We are relying on a block grant and then a small amount of top-up. And so often, much of our money is spent on mitigating the excesses of the Westminster government. So it doesn't leave an awful lot there. So I think there's a great will for a national care service. I think we'll have problems implementing it, not least because there's a lack of care service workers. And that's not just about low pay. That's about just the inability to have workers at the moment. And of course, that takes us into the other discussion of Brexit and freedom of movement. So there's a lot of things to be sorted out here. A lot of work going on in the background, a lot of reporting, and it will be interesting to see the result of all of that.
It strikes me when you compare the proposed National Care Service to the existing National Health Service, there must have been similar debates in the 40s about how can you actually set up such a huge thing, how can you possibly commit that much money and then switch the whole of the health industry into working for public care instead of private profit. That was an amazing change in policy, and it took World War II to do that. So has anyone ever done anything like this in peacetime? It's the similar scale of initiative, isn't it?
Well, interestingly, the Highlands had a sort of Highland Health Service way before the National Health Service came in. So there was a sort of pioneering Highlands and Islands Health Service. I think, to give them their due, it was the Liberals of the time that set that up, and then of course it was Labour who brought in the National Health Service. It was a wonderful feat, and we should never doubt how precious that is. And that's why so many things that the Tory government are doing down south, it's really worrying. Yeah.
So that's two responses, if you like, to the pressing problem, the question of how do we actually fund social care. So Chancellor Sunak decided to make people who are working pay for it by the uplift to national insurance. And so really the only alternative to increasing tax is to really make it a national care service, all funded by taxation. So that's what's being proposed. And of course, that's going to take a long time before it comes in.
It was real sleight of hand, Richie Sunak doing that. I have no problem with income tax rises. I mean, my personal view is that I don't mind tax being increased if it funds things like health service, social care and stuff. But for the UK government to call it a rise in national insurance, I mean, national insurance is not a separate pot. All the money that goes in through income tax and national insurance is just flung into the same pot. I learned that when I sat in the Smith Commission. They are not separated. So all he was doing was a tax rise, basically, and trying to massage people's views on it by saying, well, it's not tax, it's national insurance. And people think that will automatically be ring-fenced for things like care budget. No, it's not.
Now, talking about tax and the Smith Commission, one of the extra powers the Scottish Government received, of course, was some freedom to alter income tax, not the rest of them. We can't control national insurance, we can't do anything about VAT or corporation tax. There's probably about 20 taxes, and out of all of those we have one. So the Scottish Government can vary the bands at which somebody moves from one tax level to the next, and it can also vary the percentages at 19, 20, 21% that you pay on that. So let's just quickly have a look at that. So what the Scottish Government decided to do yesterday was to keep the percentages the same. So if you're on a 20% basic rate, or a 21% intermediate rate, that does not change. What does alter slightly is the band, the point at which your income moves from one level to the next. That will go up with inflation, but the top rate doesn't change. Now, so that means if you're earning above 43,000, you'll then go into the top rate. So that's actually a kind of a progressive policy, because Kate Forbes decided not to increase the level at which the top rate comes in. So that's been described as a progressive measure, because I think, if I get that rightly, it means that, more people will pay the top rate. If inflation's about something like 5%, and therefore
Yeah.
presumably wages will creep up by 3 or 4%. So some people, as they get a wage rise, will move into the top rate, but majority of people on the basic and intermediate rates, the amount of tax they pay is not going to change.
That's right. Most people won't pay any more tax by their calculations. But, those who earn more will pay a wee bit more. I mean, I think it's progressive. I would like the UK to be more progressive because, as you say, Hugh, the Scottish Government is limited in what it can do. And also, it's a bit of a step into the dark because there's this time lag between block grant adjustment and what the Scottish Government earns, under the financial settlements. So that all has to be reviewed and looked at again. It always was the case that it should be. So that's not something that's been called for particularly. It was always the case that should be reviewed once we've seen how the operation of it carried on. So, yeah, and as I say, I would like to see the UK government being more progressive in tax, as well as being more aggressive on tax avoidance and all these things that we've talked about many times. Because, to hammer people on universal credit by taking away 20 quid, but not doing anything about tax havens, I just find it hypocrisy at the highest level.
Yes, if you want to raise tax money, you'll definitely get a lot more if you grab a few billionaires and make them pay. So there is a slight increase in the progressive nature of the tax. So let me just go over what that means. So generally speaking, if you earn more, you pay more. I think what people don't often realise is that if you're in the top rate, which is 46%, that doesn't, of course, mean you pay 46% of everything you earn.
Yeah.
It only means any additional income above 150,000, you pay 43 and a pound on that extra bit, but you still don't pay any more than on all the previous stuff. So I think sometimes Conservative papers in particular tend to suggest that SNP or previously Labour governments are going to squeeze you, take everything you earn. But of course, that's not the case at all.
That's right. I mean, it's what you say, even at that lower one. I think you said it was 43,000. If you earn that, you kick into the higher tax band. But you will only pay the higher tax on what you earn above the 43,000.
The extra bit,
not the whole thing. But yeah, you're right. The Tories in particular tried to put it over as if the SNP and Labour, to be fair, just want to take all your money off you and give you nothing in return, as far as they're concerned.
Yes, I don't know why it is. As I said, there's loads of taxes. In fact, VAT raises about the same amount of money as income tax, but income tax is the only headline one that people talk about. Tell me, is that why it was devolved in the Smith Commission? Is that because, is it the one that people always moan about, income tax?
Well, it was the easiest one to devolve, because if you remember, we already had the ability of a variation. That was part of what came in 1999 and was never used. So it was an extension of that. VAT was difficult because of the European Union dimension, which doesn't apply anymore. Not being in Parliament anymore, I don't know all about the machinations and the discussions that are going on, but that certainly changed. National insurance, others weren't willing to even to discuss that. But it was during these discussions where you saw that there was no ring fencing and that it was all just the one pot. So income tax variation, particularly in the bandings and things, was probably the one that could be implemented with the least trouble.
But we are under a constraint anyway, and as people have said before, you can't really alter the rates too much because we're tied to the UK economy. So again, not having autonomy means, again, there is some room for manoeuvre in tax, but not very much.
No, it's not much.
But I think Kate Forbes did say that the measures taken will probably raise a bit more money, but mainly through that idea of not changing the bands. So as people's income gradually increases, the more people will move.
Do you know, I'm really impressed with Kate Forbes. I was impressed with her when I was in Parliament and when she took over as Cabinet Secretary for Finance. I thought she was an amazingly clever and decent young woman. But being on the outside now looking in, I'm even more impressed. She has a certainty about her and a decency about her that I think is great. And I'm interested to see how she progresses from here.
Yes, as I've said, we don't have time to go through them all, but we have received a lot of favourable comments from various advocacy and various sectional groups in Scotland on some of the measures that have been taken in the budget.
Yeah.
Again, that was discussed thoroughly by Andrew last night. If anybody wants to look at that again, you can still find that on the channel. So I'm going to move on now, although this was also covered in the budget, but we're going to look back on the latest on the Cambo oil field proposal. And the budget again talked about the green transition, the necessity of moving away from oil and gas towards green jobs. Now let's just quickly go over the background to the Cambo. This is the name of the oil field which has been identified a long time ago to the west of Shetland, but it's not been used yet, not yet been exploited. Now, the background to this, of course, is that just before the COP26 conference met in Glasgow here, the United Nations, of course, said if we have any chance of keeping global warming to below 1.5 centigrade, there must be no new oil and gas development. No new oil and gas development. That's quite clear. So the UK government is still not decided. They're still humming and hawing on that one. And to be fair, so was the Scottish Government at the start of COP26. But since then, Nicola Sturgeon's clearly said, no, we can't do it. We have to make a decision. Right, we've got to move on. So just quickly to update, we know now that recently Shell pulled out, I think it was, and I think there's been some other developments. So it looks like economically, anyway, that particular Cambo development, it looks like it's not going to happen. People have begun to say, no, this is too much trouble.
Yeah, it is looking like that. I can't remember the name of the parent company that was heading up the consortium, but Shell do have some rights. And I listened to I have no idea who it was. It was one of these things I turned on the radio, and someone who sounded like they knew what they were talking about was talking. And what she was saying was that it's all been put on hold, probably as a result of Shell pulling out. What she was saying was that even if a replacement for Shell came along and said, well, I'm willing to do this, Shell still, they would have to rely on Shell to be willing to transfer their rights. And also the parent company would have to decide whether politically and every other way this was a sensible thing to be doing. So yes, I certainly think it's a longer term now we're looking at, rather than even if the go-ahead was given by the UK government, that it would start up quickly. So yeah, it's certainly on ice, on hold, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that's where it's at.
But this leads us to the idea of the just transition. The First Minister this week, of course, was at a photo opportunity when one of the old coal power stations was finally demolished. I think it was Longannet.
Do you know, I missed that, but it sounds like a great job. Imagine being the one to press. That sounds great to me.
So that was a visual underlining of the move on from that economy. But of course, the political point the First Minister was making is that we have essentially moved away from coal. I mean, our economy was built on coal, of course. I'm old enough to remember when you couldn't see in the winter for the smoke coming out of the chimneys or coming out of the trains, and you had the winter smog where you couldn't see across the street. So we've moved on from that coal completely, and that's really what she was underlining. She said, we've got rid of all those coal jobs, mainly for other reasons, nothing to do with the environment, but they've gone, and we've still got the economy, we're still here. So she was really making the point, I think, if we can move away from coal, then surely we can move away from oil. And don't forget, there used to be something like 1 million people employed in mining. You know, in the 40s, we were going back to the great day of the foundation of the NHS. 1 million people in the mining industry and probably about 500,000 in railways. So coal really kept the country going in the 1950s, and now we've just stopped. So I think she's trying to say, well, if we did that, we can do the same again. We can move away from coal and oil, but not overnight. It's a long transition.
Well, yeah. It's a really difficult one. Just transition, yeah. That's exactly what we need. But in losing all these coal jobs, it was a great sacrifice for a lot of communities, some of whom I would suggest haven't fully recovered even now. And then when you move on and you look at the way that the steel industry was completely scrapped by the Conservatives of a few decades ago, certainly, near where I live in Lanarkshire, there are communities that haven't recovered from that either. So there's never been a just transition. So it's a great ambition, have a just transition. I have confidence that all those involved with putting that in place are looking very carefully at how we achieve it. And I want great care to be taken. The Scottish Government seems confident that this can be achieved. I want it to be achieved because we do have to save the planet. That's just not in doubt. But it's not going to happen overnight. And we have to take great care. I have a concern about not producing as much oil, but still importing oil. I can't give figures on that. I would like to see some of these figures. I would like to see the projections for how long this will take. It really does have to be just. It has to look after individuals, families, and therefore communities, and ultimately the country. I know there's been some good news about the repurposing of rigs into wind turbines and wind farms out in the North Sea, etc. That's good. I would like to see carbon capture on a major scale back on the map after the heinous way that the Tory government dumped the main carbon capture plant that we were proposing. I'd like to see that back on the agenda. And yes, I would like a lot of honesty about this. And I would, if I'm being perfectly honest, I would like to understand it more. I want to see the long-scale projections. I want to see us using wind, using water. I want to see us looking at things like hydrogen, and I know you're keen on that as well, Hugh, about, yes, we keep talking about electric vehicles, etc., but, we have started looking at hydrogen vehicles as well, and that's really important, especially when you're talking about public service fleets, right across council to health service and everything else. So yes, I'd like to see that.
Yes, we did mention hydrogen just before we started, and there is, of course, a hydrogen strategy. This is not just my idea. Both the UK government and the Scottish government have published hydrogen strategies, which you can look at on their website. So that's maybe part of the solution, because hydrogen, incident, I don't know if you knew this, but you can actually you can put hydrogen into your domestic gas.
Absolutely.
It's quite likely your central heating might be running on a wee bit of hydrogen at the moment.
I went to a really interesting seminar once, which I struggled to understand all the detail, I have to say, but that's what it was about. And they were saying how people get really worried at the idea of hydrogen because we've always thought of it as, quite a volatile fuel. But the expertise and technology that we have now can do this.
Yeah, so there is a possible, again, this is something we need to look at, and we are actually going to plan a programme on hydrogen.
Oh,
can we move to a hydrogen economy? But certainly it's worthwhile having a look at those proposals. But I think that at the moment they're really at the stage of being a pilot scheme. There's no real there's no real strategy in place to move the whole economy onto hydrogen because people don't want to make that decision. Will it work? But there certainly are advantages. For example, if you've got a couple of windy days where you've got too much electricity in the Orkneys, you could use that to separate hydrogen and store it. So hydrogen could then be a way of storing that energy if you can then burn it the following day when the wind drops.
We need a scientist, I think, don't we, on to tell us all about this?
We should get a special programme and get some people in who know about the industry. But the final point before we move on there, Linda, of course, is that you talked about the Acorn development in St Fergus off Aberdeen,
that was what it's called,
which the Scottish Government had a lot of faith in, and various companies, including the engineering company coordinating it, had published lots of prospectuses, and the whole thing was cancelled not by the Scottish Government but by the UK Government. So again, we'd like to do that. We'd like to maybe move in that direction, maybe make some explorations into the hydrogen economy, but we don't have the legal power to go ahead with it.
Well, that's right, because it's reserved matters. Yet again, we get stymied by reserved matters.
So that's obviously something we're going to come back to because we want to keep the lights on, but we want to keep the temperature of the planet below 1.5 increase. So obviously that's a story we're going to come back on. 2 points to finish up with tonight, which are both connected. First of all, today, the 10th of December, is International Human Rights Day. Now, this is the day when the UN says to everybody, let's not forget the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. All people have inalienable rights to peace, to liberty, and to avoiding oppression. I forget what the exact word is. Everyone has the right to live, basically.
Yeah.
And we're going to underline that today by talking about the Nobel Peace Prize. And this has been awarded to two journalists. Now, journalists, of course, in various theatres are under a huge amount of pressure the other day. It was just recently, again, the Saudi government was being criticised for the actual murder of a journalist in the Saudi embassy in Turkey, I think it was. So that's actually a thing that happened. That's not alleged. The journalist Khashoggi was actually murdered in the premises of the Saudi government. So there's also been several journalists over the years have been shot in Russia. So we need journalism, don't we? We need, as people who live in democracies with difficult choices to make, we need to know that we can rely on journalism to tell us what's happening, and not giving us just the government's line, don't we? Journalists are important, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, many places in the world, journalists are oppressed. I mean, there's still, talking about Saudi Arabia, a young man who was a blogger is still in jail in Saudi Arabia. He's been whipped with public lashing a few times. Recently, Amnesty International have been campaigning about a young woman journalist in Iran who's been jailed, and Scottish Pen and their equivalents across the globe never stop campaigning for writers and journalists all over the place who are held in terrible, terrible situations. And we do need journalists. We need investigative journalists, people who will say this is what's happening. Because if we close our eyes to all these things and we don't know what's happening, how will we ever change things? We so rely on them. And I'm glad that these young journalists have won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's a really important message to send out. And I'm worried about journalists in all different places in the world just now where things are happening. And, we have to help them to get the truth out there. We've just heard what's happening in Bosnia at the moment. That's a real concern. And the journalists there need our support to be able to tell the truth and not be scared to tell the truth. Same with photographers. You get people who say, how can you take these photographs and, not try to stop that? They take these photographs because that's a window to the rest of the world, so as the rest of the world can try and stop it. We've got to keep trying. You never stop trying.
Yeah, the journalists who this week are being recognised by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee are Dmitry Muratov from Russia and Maria Ressa from the Philippines. So their particular contribution is that, first of all, Maria is the co-founder of Rappler, which exposes abuses of power and growing authoritarianism in the Philippines under President Duterte. And Dmitry Muratov is the editor of Novaya Gazeta, which is one of the prominent defenders of freedom of speech in Russia today. Now, I'm glad that we just need to come into the studio here and take a COVID test, but I mean, imagine the situation where you don't know if you're going to get shot as you walk into your work.
It's just beyond, beyond any thoughts that we can have, and it happens all over the place. Not just to journalists, but to, here we are on Human Rights Days, and you could reel off a string of countries where we're really, really concerned about human rights that have been in the news recently. 70 odd years since the Human Rights Act was put in place. We still have people who are persecuted and oppressed, sometimes with those in power in more fortunate countries turning a blind eye. It's ongoing.
Now, here in Europe, we of course also have the European human rights bodies to which Britain is a signatory, and I hope that continues to be the case. We're used to thinking of Europe as a place of peace since the end of World War II, but on the borders of Europe, the border of the EU to the east, it's not always been peaceful.
No.
Now, we're beginning to this week hear from Bosnia of really very unpleasant warnings that it could be back to war there. There is a real possibility of war. The United Nations has said today Bosnia must walk back from the cliff because the nationalist leader Milorad Dodik of Republika Srpska is clearly making moves which will lead to that country splitting in two. In fact, what he's saying is that the Serbian part of the sort of two-part parliament, the Serbian part is actually saying we might move away from our own. I'm talking about the armed forces, right? He's saying that instead of being part of the general Bosnian armed forces, we'll just have our guys part of the Republic of Serbia armed forces. So, I mean, that's splitting a country. If you actually say we are setting up our own army, right?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, they're talking about pulling out of the Bosnian institutions that were agreed in the peace talks. What's that? 20 odd years ago
yes,
now.
the Dayton.
The date, that was it, the Dayton Agreement. You know, so they're talking about pulling Serbs out of the institutions and setting up their own institutions. And yes, the most worrying aspect of that is the military. Because what happened there in the 90s was, remember the siege of Sarajevo? Maybe some of our listeners are too young to remember that, but they'll have heard about it. They'll certainly have heard about Srebrenica and the atrocities there. It was absolutely horrendous. You know, what happened in Kosovo and everywhere else. The very idea of going back to that, because it was genocide. And, you know, to think that on the International Day of Human Rights, something like this is looking like coming up again. I know that the US, Biden and his administration are holding diplomatic talks at the moment. There's also been threats to sanctions, but this leader, what's it,
Dodik.
Dodik, you know, he's basically saying, don't give a toss about that. You can say what you like, you know. I mean, some of the independent commentators have said that while they might be up for it, the people might not be up for it. I hope that's true. I absolutely hope that's true. Because the idea of going back to that is just horrendous. And the knock-on effects it will have in that region and beyond, let's face it, you know.
Well, it certainly looks like this week there are moves towards partition, and the Bosnian state that was set up by those Dayton agreements 26 years ago, I think. Yeah, it was 1995, when the United States and United Nations brokered the peace. And the peace was basically power sharing. It's a phrase that's very familiar to people in this part of the world. But that power sharing looks like it's threatened with partition by Dudik and the Serb nationalists. So nationalism is always it's a very dangerous political weapon. If you go that direction, it can lead to a very unpleasant place.
The nationalism that says, which sadly is his kind of nationalism, and was, in my reading, the Serbian nationalism of the time, which said, we're better than everyone else round about us. That's not a civic nationalism. That's not a nationalism that says we have the right in our country, about which there is no dispute in the borders, by the way, here in Scotland. We have the right to make our own decisions. It's a completely different right-wing thing, and it's horrendous. Because the minute you start to think people are lesser than you then start to think it's okay to treat them very badly. And, you know, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, in his speech that he issued today, he was talking about equalities and that everybody, not that everybody should have the same or that we're all absolutely equal in everything, but that nobody is lesser and everyone should be going, you know, equality of opportunity and treated with great respect. And that's not what's happening in the nationalism that we're seeing in Bosnia at the moment.
Well, yes, I know Serbs are always complaining that people always blame Serbs. They'll say there was atrocities on both sides, but nonetheless, there's always been, I think, a very masculine kind of aggressive nationalism, and Dodik is an example of that. He said last week, "I'm not a coward. I wasn't elected to be a coward." There's all this big macho talk.
Yeah, it's not about the people. It's not about the Serbian people. It's about those that end up in power. And it's very, very easy. My goodness, and to a lesser degree, but at the beginning of that scale, we have seen it in the UK, the way they talk about immigration, the way they talk about asylum seekers. It's the very beginning of that scale, which is the demonising of others and making those who are settled and fortunate, relatively, making them feel that they're getting a hard time because of these people. It's nasty. It's horrible.
yes.
And Dodick is an expert.
Yes, maybe if some Conservatives are talking about human rights again in House of Commons, they could have a look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which are inalienable. It doesn't matter what race you are. They belong to everyone automatically. So we'll leave it at that. Linda Fabiani, thank you for joining us in the studio tonight. It's been great to see you again. And don't forget, we'll be back on Sunday with the full Scottish. So thanks for watching again tonight. And it's especially thanks if you're one of our regular subscribers. It's great to have your support. If you would like to help us make more programmes, please have a look at the link on there and you could donate, or you can become one of our subscribers on the website. So that's about it from Scotland at 7 tonight. From me, Hugh Stewart, and from Linda Fabiani. So thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you later. Bye.